Kiev, December 6, 1240. Princess Anastasia Rurkovna stands at the highest tower of her family's palace, watching the horizon burn. The smell of smoke and death carries on the winter wind as 40,000 Mongol warriors advance across the frozen steppe like a plague of locusts. Behind her, she can hear her husband, Prince Mickey, shouting orders to their remaining guards. But she knows it's hopeless. The great walls of Kiev have already been breached by Mongol siege engines, and the screams echoing from the lower city tell her everything she needs to know about their fate. But Anastasia isn't watching the destruction of her city with the despair of an ordinary victim. She is watching with the terrible knowledge of exactly what awaits her when those Mongol soldiers finally reach her palace. Because 3 months ago, she received a letter from her sister, Maria, who had been captured when the Mongols took Ria. The letter described things so horrifying, so deliberately cruel, that Anastasia had burned it immediately after reading it. But the words remained seared into her memory. And now, as she watches the approaching army, every syllable of her sister's final message echoes in her mind. The Mongols don't just kill the wives of their enemies. They don't even simply torture them and then grant the mercy of death. What they do is infinitely worse. A systematic process of degradation so refined, so perfectly calibrated to break the human spirit, that death becomes not a fear, but a desperate hope that will never be fulfilled. And Anastasia knows that within hours she will discover firsthand why her sister's letter ended with the words, "Pray that God takes you before they find you." What you're about to learn isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. This is the story of 7 specific methods that the Mongol Empire developed to transform the wives and daughters of enemy nobles into living examples of absolute defeat. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to break not just individual women, but entire civilizations. And I warn you, once you understand the full scope of what these women endured, you'll realize that some knowledge comes with a price, and some truths are almost too terrible to bear. As the first Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon that December morning, Princess Anastasia could already hear the distant sound of their Vardar, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo the beating of her own terrified heart. The Mongols had perfected psychological warfare long before they perfected their siege tactics, and everything about their approach was designed to maximize fear. The drums, the smoke, the deliberate slow advance that gave their victims time to contemplate what was coming. All of it served to break enemy morale before the actual battle even began. But for the noble women watching from their towers and palaces, this psychological preparation served an even more sinister purpose. It gave them time to understand that they weren't just facing conquest or death. They were facing something far more sophisticated and infinitely more cruel. The Mongols had spent decades perfecting their treatment of captured enemy wives, developing methods that would serve as both punishment for resistance and a warning to future enemies. The first method that awaited Princess Anastasia and her fellow noblewomen was what the Mongols called the ceremony of submission. This wasn't simply forcing captured women to acknowledge Mongol authority. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to destroy everything these women had been taught about honor, dignity, and their place in the world. The ceremony began immediately after capture while the shock of defeat was still fresh, and the women's minds were most vulnerable to psychological manipulation. When the Mongol general Subutai conquered the fortress city of Koselsk in 1238, he implemented the ceremony with particular cruelty. Princess Eufrine, the wife of Prince Vasily, who had died defending the walls, was forced to kneel in the city's main square while Mongol soldiers stripped away not just her clothing but every symbol of her former status. Her jeweled crown was placed on the head of a Mongol horse. Her silk gown was torn into rags and distributed among enemy soldiers as cleaning cloths. Her wedding ring was melted down before her eyes and forged into a horseshoe nail. But the physical humiliation was only the beginning. Yupers was then forced to repeat in her own language a detailed confession of her people as inferiority and her gratitude for Mongol conquest. The words had been carefully crafted by Mongol scholars who understood Russian culture. and every sentence was designed to force her to verbally destroy everything she had once held sacred. She had to thank the Mongols for freeing her from the ignorance of Christianity, express joy at the destruction of her backward people, and beg for the privilege of serving her conquerors in whatever capacity they deemed appropriate. The ceremony concluded with what the Mongols considered their masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Yuprasin was given a choice. She could maintain her dignity by refusing to participate any further, in which case she would be immediately executed alongside her children, or she could complete her submission by personally participating in the desecration of her own family as burial chapel. The choice wasn't between dignity and survival. It was between different forms of spiritual death, and the Mongols had calculated exactly which option most women would choose. Yuprasin chose survival, just as the Mongols knew she would. She took the torch they offered her and set fire to the chapel where her ancestors had been buried for generations. As the flames consumed the sacred icons and ancient tombs, she was forced to stand and watch, knowing that she had become not just a victim of Mongol conquest, but an active participant in the destruction of her own heritage. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. She had been transformed from a tragic victim into a collaborator, and the shame of the transformation would torture her far more effectively than any physical punishment ever could. But this was only the first method, and for women like Princess Anastasia, who possessed particularly strong wills or important symbolic value, the Mongols had developed far more sophisticated approaches. The second method was known as the Garden of Living Flowers, and it represented perhaps the most psychologically complex form of torture ever devised by medieval minds. The garden was established outside the city of Samarkand in 1220, after Genghis Khan's forces conquered the Khwarezmian capital. Unlike other forms of torture that sought to break their victims quickly, the garden was designed to preserve noble women in a state of perpetual psychological torment that could last 4 years. Princess Turken-Katan, the mother of the defeated Shah, was the first and most prominent victim of this particular method. The garden itself was genuinely beautiful, an elaborate complex of pavilions, fountains, and flowering trees that would have been considered luxurious in any other context. Captured noble women were housed in individual pavilions, dressed in fine silks, and provided with servants to attend to their every need. To an outside observer, they appeared to be living in paradise. But the true horror of the garden lay not in what was present, but in what was systematically withheld. The women were never allowed to communicate with each other. Despite being housed within sight of one another, they could see their fellow captives walking in their own gardens, eating their solitary meals, and sitting alone in their pavilions. But any attempt at communication resulted in immediate punishment, not to themselves, but to the other women they had tried to contact. This created a situation where every natural human impulse toward companionship became a source of guilt and self-reproach. Princess Turken-Katan spent 3 years in the garden, watching other noble women arrive, observing their gradual psychological deterioration, and slowly coming to understand that she was not just a prisoner, but a living exhibit in a museum of defeated nobility. Mongol officials would bring visitors, diplomats, merchants, and other conquered peoples to view the garden and see how even the most exalted women of enemy civilizations have been reduced to decorative objects, beautiful and powerless. The third method was reserved for women who showed particular intelligence or political acumen, qualities that the Mongols recognized as potentially dangerous even in captivity. This method was called the Mirror of Truth, and it involved a form of psychological manipulation so subtle that many victims never fully understood what was being done to them until it was too late to resist. When the Mongols conquered Baghdad in 1258, they captured Zumrud Khodan, the brilliant and politically astute wife of the last of Bayezkaif. Rather than simply imprisoning or torturing her, they assigned her a Mongol advisor whose job was to gradually convince her that everything she had believed about her people, her culture, and her faith had been fundamentally wrong. The process was incredibly sophisticated. The advisor, a captured Chinese scholar who had himself undergone a similar conversion, would engage Zumurrud in philosophical discussions about governance, religion, and social organization. He would present seemingly innocent questions that gradually forced her to confront contradictions in her worldview. Why at all allow the Islamic Empire to fall if Islam was the true faith? How could the Islamic legal system be superior to Mongol law if it had proven unable to defend Islamic peoples? If Arab civilization was truly advanced, why had it been so easily conquered by barbarian nomads? The beauty of this method was that it made the victim an active participant in her own mental destruction. Zumurrud wasn't simply told that her beliefs were wrong. She was guided through a process of logical reasoning that seemed to prove it to herself. By the time she realized what was happening, her faith in everything she had once held sacred had been so thoroughly undermined that she had no mental foundation left from which to mount resistance. The fourth method represented the Mongols' understanding that for many noble women, physical torture was less terrifying than the destruction of their maternal identity. This method was called the School of Proper Motherhood, and it was implemented with devastating effectiveness during the conquest of Kiev, where Princess Anastasia would eventually experience it firsthand. Captured noble women who had children were separated from them immediately upon capture. But rather than simply being told their children were dead or had been sold into slavery, they were informed that their children were being properly educated according to Mongol principles. The mothers were then forced to witness this education process, watching as their children were systematically taught to despise everything their mothers had tried to instill in them. Princess Anastasia's 6-year-old son, Pavel, was brought to her cell every few days. But each visit revealed further evidence of his transformation. He learned to speak Mongol before Russian, to worship Tengri instead of Christ, and to view his father as death not as a heroic sacrifice, but as the foolish stubbornness of an inferior people. Most cruelly, he was taught to pity his mother for her inability to understand the wisdom of Mongol civilization. The psychological torture for Anastasia was exquisite in its precision. She could see that her son was physically healthy, well-fed, and even happy in his new life. But every interaction with him drove deeper. The knife of realization that she was losing him not to death, which she could have accepted, but to a fundamental transformation that made him a stranger wearing her child's face. Within months, Pavel began to speak to her with the patient condescension of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, explaining why her old-fashioned ideas were harmful and why she needed to embrace Mongol wisdom for her own good. The fifth method was perhaps the most physically brutal, but it was implemented with such calculated precision that it transcended mere torture and became a form of artistic cruelty. The Mongols called it the Dance of Seven Veils, borrowing the name from an ancient Middle Eastern story, but perverting its meaning in ways that would have horrified its originators. This method was typically reserved for the wives of enemy commanders who had proven particularly troublesome or whose defeats the Mongols wanted to commemorate with special emphasis. The woman would be placed in an arena-like setting surrounded by Mongol soldiers, enemy prisoners, and local civilians who had been forced to attend. She would then be subjected to 7 distinct phases of physical and psychological torment, each one designed to strip away another layer of her identity and dignity. The process began with the removal of the woman's clothing and jewelry, but this was done slowly, ceremonially, with each item being displayed to the crowd and its significance explained before it was destroyed. A crown represented the illusion of political power crushed underfoot. A wedding ring symbolized the weakness of emotional attachment dissolved in acid. Religious symbols demonstrated the impotence of false gods, defiled in ways too graphic to describe in detail. Each subsequent phase involved more intimate violations, not just of the body, but of everything that defined the woman as a human being. Her hair was cut in patterns that marked her as a slave. Her skin was marked with symbols that identified her as conquered property. Her voice was damaged in ways that would make speech permanently difficult, ensuring that even if she survived, she would never again be able to speak with the authority and clarity that had once commanded respect. The sixth method was reserved for women of exceptional beauty, or those who had been particularly beloved by their people. The Mongols understood that beauty and love could be transformed into weapons of psychological destruction if properly manipulated. This method was called the gift of eternal service, and it represented perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of human psychology that medieval warfare had ever achieved. Beautiful captive women were not disfigured or killed, but rather preserved and enhanced. They were given the finest cosmetics, the most luxurious clothing, and the most exquisite jewelry. They were taught new arts of seduction and pleasure, trained by experts brought from across the Mongol Empire. Their beauty was maintained and even improved, but it was no longer their own. It belonged entirely to their Mongol masters to be used as a tool of conquest and control. These women were then sent as gifts to enemy cities that had not yet submitted to Mongol authority. They would arrive as apparent refugees, telling stories of Mongol brutality and seeking shelter. But their real purpose was to serve as living examples of what submission to the Mongols could offer. Their beauty, their apparent wealth, their seeming freedom, all of it was designed to make surrender seem not just preferable to resistance but actually attractive. The psychological impact on these women was devastating because they were forced to become active participants in the conquest of their own people. Every city that surrendered after seeing their example was another victory that they had helped achieve. Every life spared because of early submission was a debt that bound them more tightly to their captives. They became trapped in a web of guilt and complicity that made genuine resistance psychologically impossible. The seventh and final method was reserved for women of the highest nobility, queens, empresses, and the wives of khans and emperors. This method was called the throne of remembrance, and it was designed not just to break individual women, but to serve as eternal symbols of the futility of resistance to Mongol power. These women were not tortured in the conventional sense. Instead, they were preserved in perfect comfort and luxury, surrounded by all the trappings of their former status but rendered completely powerless to affect anything or anyone. They were living museums of defeated greatness, maintained in pristine conditions so that future generations could observe exactly what happened to those who dared oppose the Mongol Empire. The Queen of Georgia, Tamar the Great's successor, spent the last 15 years of her life sitting on a throne in Karakorum, dressed in her royal robes, surrounded by the crown jewels of her conquered kingdom. Visitors from across the empire would come to see her, and she was required to tell them the story of her defeat, to explain how her kingdom's resistance had been foolish, and how grateful she was for the wisdom of Mongol rule. But the true cruelty of the throne of remembrance was that these women retained perfect awareness of what they had lost and what they had become. They were not allowed the mercy of madness or the escape of forgetfulness. They had to remain lucid, intelligent, and articulate so that their testimony would carry weight with visitors. They became living advertisements for the consequences of resistance, preserved in perfect psychological agony for as long as their bodies could endure. As Princess Anastasia stood in her tower, the December morning in 1240, watching the Mongol army complete its encirclement of Kiev, she understood with perfect clarity that death was no longer an option available to her. The Mongols had spent too much time perfecting their methods of psychological conquest to waste them on quick executions. She would live, but she would live as something other than herself, transformed into a tool of her people's destruction and a monument to their defeat. The letter from her sister Maria had ended with a single line that now echoed in Anastasia's mind. As the Mongol war drums grew louder, "They do not kill us because our deaths would be meaningless. They transform us because our transformations destroy not just ourselves but everyone who ever loved us." When the Mongol soldiers finally reached her palace, Princess Anastasia did not resist. She had spent the morning destroying every document, every piece of art, and every family heirloom that she could reach, denying the Mongols the pleasure of forcing her to desecrate them herself. It was a small act of defiance, but it was all that remained to her. The historical records tell us that she lived for another 12 years in Mongol captivity, But the woman who had stood in that tower, watching her world end, was gone within months of her capture. What remained was something else entirely, a creation of Mongol ingenuity, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a living testament to the sophistication of medieval cruelty. These 7 methods represent more than just historical curiosities or examples of ancient brutality. They reveal a level of psychological understanding that would not be seen again until the emergence of modern totalitarian regimes. The Mongols had discovered that destroying a person's body was far less effective than destroying their identity while preserving their physical form. As a vessel for the destruction, the women who endured these torments deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as unwilling pioneers who were forced to explore the furthest boundaries of human suffering. Their stories remind us that there are indeed fates worse than death, and that the most sophisticated cruelties are often those that masquerade as mercy. If these forgotten stories have moved you, if these voices from the past have touched something in your soul, then subscribe to Deep Historians. There are countless more tales like these buried beneath centuries of sanitized history, waiting for someone willing to tell them truthfully. These women lived and died in agony so that we might understand the true cost of conquest and the real meaning of resistance. Remember Princess Anastasia standing in her tower, choosing to destroy what she could rather than watch it be transformed into something obscene. Remember that courage sometimes looks like destruction, that love sometimes requires letting go, and that the greatest victory these women achieved was simply retaining enough of themselves to know what they had lost. Because in the end, the most important thing we can do for the victims of history is to see them clearly, to understand what they truly endured, and to ensure that their suffering was not entirely meaningless. They cannot be saved, but they can be remembered. And sometimes remembrance is the only justice that remains possible.